Hi guys. Tonight we step into a place that looks magnificent on postcards and in television dramas, but in truth would make you question every romantic fantasy you ever had about knights and noble lords. You're entering a medieval castle, not in the warmth of midday, not during a summer tour, but at dusk on a winter's night. The moment you cross the threshold, the air changes. The outside may be bitter, but inside these vast stone walls, you discover a new kind of cold, one that doesn't just nip at your fingers, but seems to sink into your very bones, and you probably won't survive this night. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're awake enough, post your location and local time in the comments. I love knowing where and when you're listening. Now, dim the lights and let yourself drift gently into the story. You trudge across the drawbridge, and the iron portcullis creaks above you. The stones beneath your boots radiate no warmth, only an icy indifference. Historians tell us castles were marvels of defense, strongholds designed to repel invaders with thick walls and ingenious traps. But those same walls that kept arrows and fire out also kept the winter in. They absorb the day's meager sunlight and return nothing but dampness at night. You glance up at the battlements and imagine guards pacing, their breath steaming like smoke in the twilight. The wind whistles through cracks you didn't think could exist in such massive walls. You wonder, if stone is supposed to be solid, why does it feel like the air itself leaks right through? Scholars still argue whether medieval builders understood the full consequences of their design, or whether practicality and defense always trumped comfort. Step inside, and the scent of wet limestone and wood smoke hits your nose. The great hall stretches before you, and yet, even here, the chill refuses to leave. It clings to every surface, sliding down pillars and creeping into the hems of your clothes. Your fingers tighten around the coarse wool of your cloak, but the fabric only scratches your skin while letting icy drafts sneak in through seams. You pause near the doorway, listening to the echoes of footsteps fading into the cavernous chamber. You notice the torches mounted on the walls. Their flames sway, restless in the breeze, and you realize, if wind can dance so freely here, how can warmth ever linger? It is no coincidence that chroniclers of the time often described winter nights in castles as trials of endurance. Some even wrote letters apologizing for their shaky handwriting, blaming the unrelenting cold. A quirky tidbit? One French chronicler once joked that ink froze in his inkwell faster than his wine chilled. Your teeth chatter, and you pull your cloak tighter, but the stone walls watch silently, offering no comfort. In this moment, it becomes clear, this isn't the fairy tale castle of storybooks. This is survival, night after night, with no central heating, no insulation, and no relief, and you've only just arrived. You step farther into the great hall, expecting grandeur to make up for the icy welcome, but instead you find that the cold has multiplied. The chamber stretches high above you, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into shadow. The fire in the hearth should command the space, but the flames look pitiful compared to the vastness of the room. Every crack in the mortar, every slit in the wall, funnels in cold air that circles endlessly, like a draft determined to chase you wherever you move. The hall is meant for feasts, proclamations, and courtly gatherings, and in daylight it might even dazzle. The tapestries on the walls depict knights and saints, their colors dulled by centuries of smoke. You run your hand over the thick fabric, half hoping it will radiate warmth. Instead, it feels damp, heavy with moisture drawn straight from the stone. Historians note that tapestries did more than decorate. They attempted to insulate. Yet, scholars still debate whether they offered any meaningful protection against the bitter drafts, or if they were little more than symbolic barriers. At your feet, the echo of your boots on stone reverberates, each sound sharp as flint. The hall amplifies every small movement, so you hear your own shiver, as though the walls themselves mock your frailty. Candles flicker on long wooden tables, throwing patches of amber light that dissolve into endless shadows. The warmth from their flames doesn't reach you. It doesn't even reach the dishes they're meant to illuminate. Imagine sitting here at a feast, your hands numb as you raise a goblet, your breath fogging so thick that it becomes part of the atmosphere. You glance toward the dais, where a carved chair sits more a throne than a seat. Picture a lord or lady perched there in winter, wrapped in ermine-trimmed robes, struggling to maintain dignity while privately fighting the same shivers you feel now. Contemporary letters reveal noble complaints about frost forming on goblets, or servants finding sheets of ice inside the castle even after fires blazed. The irony: power gave them authority but not immunity to the relentless cold. And then you notice the hearth itself. Smoke curls upward, staining the rafters with a sooty haze. You draw near, letting the fire lick your cheeks with a brief glow. But step back a few paces, and the warmth is gone, swallowed whole by the drafty chamber. It's almost cruel. A single fire is like a candle trying to heat a cathedral. Records from medieval households mention the enormous expense of fuel. Cartloads of wood, bundles of peat, even dried animal dung. Still, the fires never seemed enough. One quirky note: in some German castles, it's said that entire pine trunks were dragged inside, one end burning while the rest slowly fed itself into the blaze. And yet, guests still wore cloaks indoors. You wrap your arms around yourself, rubbing your hands together, but the friction barely helps. You realize this hall, for all its splendor, isn't a sanctuary but a stage, a place for display, not comfort. Tonight it offers you little more than echoes and smoke. You breathe deeply, coughing at the acrid air, and begin to wonder how many hours you can endure before the cold overtakes even your stubborn will. You press deeper into the castle, your boots striking stone that feels more like ice than rock. At first, you expect that walking will warm you, but the floor itself betrays you. Each step seems to leach the heat right out of your soles, a slow theft that makes your bones ache. You think back to modern homes with rugs and carpeting, even underfloor heating in some cases. Here there is nothing but bare, unyielding stone, a surface chosen not for comfort but for durability and easy cleaning after messy feasts and unfortunate accidents. Archaeological studies confirm that most medieval halls and corridors had floors of raw stone, sometimes sprinkled with rushes, herbs, or straw to soften the surface and mask unpleasant smells. Your eyes scan the floor now, where a thin scattering of rushes crackles underfoot. At first you imagine they add warmth, but then your nose catches the stale, musty odor of damp leaves mixed with animal droppings. In truth, these rushes were rarely replaced, as often as later accounts claimed. Some lords supposedly boasted of changing them yearly, but contemporary evidence suggests weeks or months could pass before new layers were spread. That meant insects thrived in the decomposing mat. One eccentric anecdote even tells of frogs hopping among the rushes in particularly wet castles, as if the cold weren't punishment enough. You walk onward, and the echo follows you, hollow and relentless. Your ears fill with the rhythmic tap of boot against stone, and you realize this is the soundtrack every inhabitant endured day and night, a reminder of the castle's indifference. Chroniclers of the era often noted that drafts rose not only from walls but also from below. These floors, directly connected to the ground, or poorly insulated vaults beneath, acted like funnels for the earth's chill. Some scholars suggest that in winter, these stone slabs effectively turned rooms into giant refrigerators. Others argue that medieval builders were aware of the problem and tried limited fixes, like laying wooden planks in chambers for nobles. The evidence is mixed, leaving us to wonder whether warmth was a true goal or simply a rare luxury. Your feet grow numb as though blood itself resists circulation. You tug your cloak tighter around your legs, but the icy stone insists on its dominance. Imagine trying to sleep here, wrapped in wool but pressed against flooring that never yields its cold. The thought alone sends a shiver up your spine. You can almost hear the whispers of servants padding across these same floors, barefoot, balancing trays or buckets, their skin meeting raw stone at every step. It is no wonder records mention chilblains and frostbite, not just among peasants but even within noble households. The sheer indifference of this architecture becomes clearer with each pace. Castles were built to resist siege, not to nurture warmth. The very design ensured the enemy was kept at bay, but also guaranteed that comfort was exiled with equal severity. You pause by a narrow passage and place your palm on the wall. The stone is clammy, slick with condensation. Your breath clouds instantly, merging with the damp air. You realize now why some medieval accounts mention mold and rot spreading even in grand halls. Cold and damp were not passing inconveniences, they were housemates. And yet, people lived here for centuries. They adapted, endured, and sometimes even thrived within these harsh environments. It is a testament to human resilience or stubbornness that communities flourished behind these walls. But one can't help smiling at a peculiar practice. In some records, children were encouraged to play and stomp about indoors, not just for amusement but to keep their bodies from stiffening in the cold. You picture small figures dashing about, their laughter echoing against stone, while adults huddled near weak fires, resigned to another night of icy endurance. Still, questions remain. Did they ever truly feel at home in these spaces, or did they simply survive them? Was the grandeur of stone worth the constant battle against winter? Historians of architecture continue to wrestle with the paradox. Castles stood as symbols of power and prestige, yet offered some of the least hospitable domestic conditions imaginable. The grandeur came at a human cost, and tonight you are paying a fraction of that price with every shiver, every step across the frozen floor. As you pause, your toes curling inside your boots, you wonder how long until you can no longer feel them at all. The floor will not relent, and the night has only just begun. You drift toward the hearth again, thinking perhaps the flames will finally offer sanctuary. The fire hisses, spitting sap from a half-burned log, and you extend your hands. For a moment, your fingers tingle with life. Then, as you lean back, the heat evaporates like a dream upon waking. The great chamber swallows the fire's generosity, leaving you almost as cold as before. This is no accident. Contemporary records repeatedly describe castle hearths as inadequate for the space they were meant to warm. Even when dozens of logs blazed, only those within arm's reach felt relief. The very design of these fireplaces emphasized smoke management over comfort. Tall chimneys drew flames upward, while heat vanished into the sky. One medieval writer remarked that a fire seemed to warm heaven more than earth, a biting comment on the futility of these household flames. You look around and notice servants carrying bundles of wood, their shoulders bent from the weight. Fuel was an endless demand. Cartloads of oak and beech arrived daily, yet never seemed enough. In harsher winters, records show noble households rationing fires, placing priority on the Lord's chamber or chapel. In poorer households, peat bricks or even dried dung became common substitutes. Modern readers might wrinkle their noses at the thought, but for many, smoke from dung was preferable to the bone-deep cold. A curious anecdote survives from a household account in Burgundy. One enterprising steward allegedly ordered whole pine trunks dragged inside, burning one end, while gradually feeding the rest into the hearth. It must have looked absurd, a tree half swallowed by stone, yet still, guests wrapped themselves in cloaks, unimpressed by the meager warmth. This is the sort of eccentric detail that lingers in memory, a reminder of the desperation to cheat winter. And what of the smoke? You cough softly, your throat catching on the acrid air. Even with chimneys, smoke rarely rose cleanly. Drafts pushed it back into the room, filling eyes with tears. Many letters from the 15th century complain of stinging throats and red eyes after evenings in the hall. Some chroniclers claim constant smoke exposure damaged lungs and shortened lives. Modern researchers debate the extent. Was smoke truly a silent killer, or merely an accepted nuisance of medieval life? The truth remains clouded, just like the rafters above you. Your gaze travels upward where centuries of soot still cling, blackening carved beams until they look like charred skeletons. The air smells of ash, a constant perfume that never washes away. Imagine feasting here, trying to taste roasted meat while the smell of burning resin lingers in your nostrils. You glance at the torches lining the walls. They sputter, barely brighter than the hearth, and you realize they add smoke without warmth. You shift closer to the fire again, stubbornly holding out your palms. The skin tightens, prickling with fleeting heat. For a moment you imagine relief, but the cold creeps back almost immediately. You understand now why medieval households relied on layers of clothing rather than flames. Fires were symbolic, a focal point of gathering, but never a reliable shield against the night. One scholar once compared a castle hearth to a candle in a cavern, capable of light, incapable of comfort. The metaphor feels painfully apartment, yet you can't help reflecting on the irony. These vast stone strongholds, symbols of wealth and dominion, could not even guarantee a warm evening for their inhabitants. Their magnificence was inseparable from misery. And so you sit, feeling the duality of the hearth. Its glow is real, its promise false. The fire dances merrily, but you remain cold, a guest unwelcome in your own refuge. As sparks drift upward into the dark chimney throat, you wonder how many generations stared into similar flames, whispering silent prayers for morning to come quickly. You pull away from the hearth, resigned to the truth. No fire, however bright, will shield you from the castle's winter grip. Instead, you fumble with the layers of rough wool draped over your body. The fabric scratches at your skin, stiff from years of repeated wear and imperfect washing. You tug one cloak tighter, add another over your shoulders, and still you feel the cold press through as though the garments were little more than cobwebs. It is well attested in wardrobe accounts that medieval clothing emphasized layers above all. Undergarments of linen clung to the skin, overlaid with tunics, cloaks, surcoats, and hoods. Wealthy lords and ladies owned garments lined with fur squirrel, fox, or even ermine, if they wished to flaunt prestige. Yet for every noble wrapped in costly fur, dozens of servants trudged about in threadbare wool, shivering as they carried trays or scrubbed stone floors. Clothing was the first defense against cold, but never the last. You rub your sleeves, hoping friction will bring heat. Instead, you feel the prick of coarse fibers against your wrists. Imagine a noblewoman at her dressing bench, tugging on gown after gown, assisted by handmaidens who also shivered while fastening endless laces. A manuscript from 14th century England lists winter garments in careful detail, praising wool's durability while lamenting its itch. And still, people complain that no amount of layering truly conquered the chill. Curiously, some records describe eccentric strategies. In a Danish household, men were said to stuff dried moss into their boots as insulation. In other places, peasants bound straw around their legs like makeshift gaiters. These odd improvisations make you smile briefly, until you look down at your own feet and wonder whether moss might be an improvement right now. But beyond clothing lies debate. Were medieval people simply more accustomed to the cold than we are? Some scholars maintain that constant exposure hardened them, that children raised in unheated chambers built natural resilience. Others counter that frequent illness and shortened life expectancy betray the real toll. The argument remains unresolved, leaving you caught between admiration and pity for those who once endured such nights without complaint. The air bites harder, slipping easily through the weave of your tunic. You imagine a knight returning from a patrol, unbuckling armor that feels like an iron refrigerator against his chest. He peels off the breastplate, then chainmail, each piece colder than the last. At last, only his padded gambeson remains, damp with sweat that chills faster than he can dry. No wonder records mention knights collapsing near hearths, desperate to thaw even as smoke stung their eyes. For the wealthy, fur offered some relief. An inventory from Burgundy lists dozens of cloaks trimmed with miniver, sable, and even lynx. But fur was heavy, often musky, and required constant care. Imagine trying to sleep under pelts that smelled faintly of the animals last winter. Not exactly a recipe for comfort, yet people clung to them as life preservers. And then there was fashion. In courts across Europe, style sometimes sabotaged survival. Long, trailing sleeves looked magnificent, but dragged through rushes and dipped into slush. Thin silks imported from the East shimmered beautifully at banquets, but offered no more warmth than parchment. You realize that vanity, too, played a role in nightly misery. A lord might impress his guests with brocade, while quietly wishing for a fur-lined cloak hidden away in his chamber. You shift your cloak once more, your fingers numb despite the effort. The itch of wool, the weight of cloth, the futility of every extra layer, these are your companions tonight. You understand why chroniclers so often praised spring, not only for its blossoms and hunts, but for the chance to shed the endless burden of heavy, scratchy garments. As you lean against the damp stone wall, the fabric at your shoulders grows clammy, soaking up the chill instead of repelling it. Your layers are failing you, just as they failed countless men, women, and children centuries before. The garments tell a story not of warmth, but of survival. And survival, as you're discovering, is never comfortable. You try to distract yourself by thinking of food, hoping perhaps the thought of a warm meal will chase away the chill. Somewhere in the castle kitchens, a pot simmers, and the faint smell of onions and smoke drifts down the corridor. You follow your nose into a vaulted chamber where the ceiling is stained black from centuries of cooking fires. A cauldron hangs over glowing embers, releasing a sluggish bubble now and then, as if reluctant to give up its heat. The diet of the Middle Ages was, by necessity, hearty. Bread, often dense and dark, formed the base of nearly every meal. When fortunes allowed, stews thick with beans, root vegetables, and perhaps a scrap of salted pork made their way onto the table. Contemporary accounts make it clear that calories were rarely lacking for the nobility. Records from the household of Edward II list barrels of beef and cartloads of fish consumed during a single winter. Yet, for all that abundance, food alone could not warm the body. Stew fills the belly, yes, but the heat is fleeting. By the time you step away from the pot, your breath fogs once again, and the cold returns with vengeance. You ladle out a portion, the wooden spoon rough against your lips. The warmth rushes down your throat, a momentary fire that quickly dissipates. Imagine a medieval family gathered around the same dish, each dipping in bread to sop up the broth. It seems communal, comforting, yet even in the act of eating, they would shiver. Chronicles describe feasts where steam rose from food and drink, while frost clung stubbornly to the windows. One particularly vivid account recalls servants breaking ice from water jugs before pouring into goblets at the Lord's table. There are curious details, too. In some northern households, hot ale was seasoned with spices in hopes of generating inner warmth. Elsewhere, cooks added mustard or horseradish to dishes, believing their sharp bite invigorated the blood. Strange remedies, perhaps, but anything was worth trying when stone walls turned supper into an endurance test. And sometimes the food itself became an enemy. Chronicles mention loaves frozen so hard in winter they needed to be thawed by the fire before they could be sliced. But how much did diet truly protect against the cold? Some researchers argue that heavy medieval fare, dense with fat and grain, supplied the calories necessary for survival. Others counter that malnutrition was common even among those who ate heartily, with poor vitamin balance leaving immune systems fragile against illness. The question remains unsettled, like so many aspects of daily life hidden behind stone. You spoon another mouthful and chew slowly. The stew is thick, earthy, filling, yet you notice your hands still tremble as you hold the bowl. You imagine sitting at a feast where dozens of courses parade before you: roasted swans, gilded pies, endless wine, and still you watch your breath rising like smoke above the table. Nobles may have displayed their power through food, but they never conquered the cold it failed to erase. You picture the kitchens themselves in winter, the cooks sweating near roaring ovens while apprentices shivered in storage rooms where meat froze solid on hooks. Some scholars suggest that in these conditions, preservation became simpler nature's refrigerator, saving the effort of salting or smoking. Yet even here, irony reigns. What preserved food for the household also tormented the bodies of those who prepared it. The stew warms your stomach, but only for a moment. Already you feel the creeping fingers of cold working their way back into your chest and limbs. You realize that food, like fire and clothing, was never enough on its own. It distracted, sustained, and briefly comforted, but in the unyielding chill of the castle night, it could not deliver lasting relief. As you set the bowl aside, the echo of clattering spoons fades into the distance. You remain in the half-dark kitchen, staring at embers that glow like tired eyes. The warmth is gone, and your body aches with the knowledge that survival here was never about triumph, but about holding on until dawn. You leave the kitchen, belly heavy with stew but body still chilled, and drift into a side passage. Here the walls seem to sweat. Moisture gathers in little beads that glisten faintly in the torchlight, sliding down the stone until they disappear into cracks in the floor. The air is clammy, as though you've stepped into a cellar. Every breath carries the faint tang of mildew. It clings to your throat and makes you cough, a sound that echoes uncomfortably in the confined space. Moisture was the castle's constant companion. Surviving documents from masons' guilds describe how even well-built walls soaked up rain, channeling dampness through the porous stone. Add to that the breath of dozens, sometimes hundreds, of people trapped within during winter, and the very air grew heavy with water. It is recorded that wooden chests swelled and warped, parchments curled at the edges, and boots left too long against a wall rotted before spring arrived. You trail your fingers along the cold stone, only to recoil as your skin meets the slick surface. Imagine trying to hang laundry here. The fabric would never dry, only absorb more of the clammy atmosphere. In fact, some accounts describe laundry being frozen stiff on the line outside, while clothing hung indoors grew mouldy. The medieval castle was, in many ways, a paradoxical environment, freezing yet damp, airless yet drafty. There are odd details that make you raise an eyebrow. In one 15th century household record, herbs such as lavender and rosemary were scattered in chambers not just for fragrance, but because people believed they absorbed humidity. Whether that truly worked is uncertain, but the smell must have been more pleasant than mildew. Another curious note comes from a German inventory mentioning barrels of quicklime stored specifically to combat dampness in storerooms. One can imagine a steward pacing nervously as water crept across his floor, sprinkling lime like a desperate exorcist. But the damp carried more than discomfort. Some medical historians argue that these clammy environments worsened respiratory diseases. Chronicles of the time mention winter fevers and chest heaviness, terms that might hint at bronchitis or pneumonia. Others suggest the damp helped spread lice and fleas, which thrived in moist straw and fabrics. Yet not all scholars agree. A few insist the cold air itself may have slowed bacterial growth, and that the real culprits of illness were malnutrition and poor sanitation. The truth remains obscured in the mist, like your breath curling before you now. You continue walking, boots slipping slightly on patches of green moss that grow right on the floor. Imagine the servants tasked with scraping away these slick intruders, knowing they would return with the next rainfall. The chill here feels different from the airy cold of the great hall. It is deeper, insinuating itself into your chest like a wet cloth laid over your lungs. Think of a noble trying to entertain guests in such conditions. Tapestries were hung to disguise water-stained walls. Thick drapes covered drafty doorways, their fabric heavy with damp. Even beds were not immune. Straw mattresses grew musty, leaving sleepers to toss and turn in clammy discomfort. Some letters from noblewomen complain of gowns mottled with mildew when trunks were opened after a wet season. You can almost hear the sigh of frustration as seamstresses tried to scrub away stains that never quite lifted. And yet, people adapted. Fires were stoked more for drying air than warming it. Rooms were sprinkled with rushes not just for fragrance but to soak up wetness underfoot. Dogs curled near walls to absorb some of the chill, an odd but practical solution. Imagine falling asleep with a hound pressed against your side, both of you steaming faintly in the candlelight, both waiting for dawn to dry the walls a little. You pause and inhale again. The air feels thick, like breathing through cloth. Your skin prickles, clammy with sweat, though you are far from hot. You realize the damp is not just an inconvenience, but an enemy, sapping vitality, seeping into clothing, bread, bedding, lungs. No fire or feast can truly drive it out. As you make your way back toward the main hall, your cough lingers, a reminder of how unrelenting this moisture island. The stone fortress, built to withstand catapults and armies, is quietly conquered each winter by something as simple as damp air, and you, too, are its victim tonight. You climb a winding stair, each step narrow, each turn leading you deeper into the marrow of the castle. The air grows sharper here, funneled by unseen gaps. When you reach a landing, you notice a slit carved into the wall, an arrow loop, narrow outside, widening inward like a funnel. By day, these slits were designed for defense, letting archers rain shafts on attackers while staying sheltered. By night, they betray their purpose, becoming icy mouths that invite the wind straight inside. The chill is immediate. You feel it snake along the stairwell, brushing against your cheek as though the castle itself were exhaling. Surviving architectural treatises describe arrow slits as both ingenious and treacherous. They offered visibility and protection, yet they were, inescapably, holes in the armor of the fortress. Some modern researchers even argue that the sheer number of these apertures turned castles into glorified wind tunnels in winter. Others counter that tapestries and shutters covered many slits when not in use, but the surviving evidence is inconsistent, leaving the matter unresolved. You lean closer, peering out. Beyond the slit, the night sky stretches, pale stars glittering in the frost. Far below, the land lies silent, fields sleeping under a brittle crust of ice. The wind rushes past, carrying the scent of pine smoke from village hearths, smoke that drifts upward from cottages which, ironically, might be warmer than the fortress where you now stand. The air whistles through the slit, producing a sound that could easily be mistaken for a ghostly sigh. Contemporary travelers sometimes described these noises in letters, insisting they heard voices of the restless dead whispering through castle walls. Whether they believed or merely jested, the sound remains uncanny. Your fingers trace the edge of the slit, rough and cold. Imagine an archer here, bow in hand, squinting into the snow while his body shook uncontrollably from exposure. Accounts of sieges often mention defenders collapsing from the cold long before arrows found them. A peculiar anecdote survives from a Scottish stronghold. It was said that archers stuffed bits of wool or moss into slits to muffle the whistling drafts at night. Whether this truly worked, or was simply wishful thinking, you can picture the desperation behind the attempt. Inside, you step back into the stairwell, only to find the draft follows. It threads through your cloak, around your ankles, into your hair. The sound of it endless, low, mournful becomes part of the night's soundtrack. And here lies a question scholars have debated. Did medieval builders underestimate the problem, or did they accept it as a necessary trade-off? Some argue that castles in milder climates hardly suffered, while northern fortresses endured relentless winter torment. The surviving remains refuse to tell the full story, leaving us with speculation and shivers. You descend again, the wind still prowling at your back. In the hall below, you notice servants trying to block arrow slits with wooden shutters, their hands fumbling in the cold. The wood creaks but never seals fully. A candle flickers madly near the opening, flame bending as if bowing to the invisible guest. The servant curses softly, pulls the shutter tighter, but the air keeps seeping through. This is the reality. No matter how grand the fortress, nature always finds a crack. You imagine yourself lying in bed later, the draft brushing across your face like a thief in the dark. Even with curtains drawn around the frame, The air will find you, chilling your nose and ears until sleep feels impossible. The slit so effective in battle becomes your tormentor in peace. You step away from the wall, shoulders hunched, cloak tight. The sighing of the arrow loops fades only slightly, never fully leaving your ears. It occurs to you that these very breaths of wind have whispered through the castle for centuries, unchanging, unrelenting, reminding every inhabitant that defense came at the price of warmth. Tonight, that price is yours to pay. You move back into the hall, where shadows tremble under the restless glow of fire and torch. At first glance, the flickering lights should promise comfort, but as you stand in their radius, you realize they betray you. The flames quiver, orange tongues darting upward, their heat so localized that it seems to vanish before reaching your skin. The glow may banish darkness, but it leaves the cold untouched. It is well established in household records that castles consumed staggering quantities of tallow candles and pitch-soaked torches. The accounts of one 15th century English estate record nearly 30,000 candles purchased for a single winter. Yet the paradox remains, all that burning light scarcely improved anyone's warmth. Candles were primarily for sight, not survival. You imagine the master of the hall barking orders under dim torchlight, his breath visible even as flames lined the walls. Your eyes adjust, and you notice how uneven the light island pools of brightness flare around sconces, while most of the chamber drowns in shadow. This irregular illumination made even familiar rooms feel haunted, their corners alive with imagined movement. Chroniclers often describe guests mistaking shadows for spirits, an impression made worse when smoke from torches curled into ghostly shapes. There's even a curious account from Burgundy of a guest stumbling in the dark, convinced a shadow was a thief. The thief turned out to be nothing more than his own elongated silhouette, cast by an unsteady flame. You rub your arms and realize that the torches contribute more smoke than comfort. The smell is acrid, sticky, worming into fabric until cloaks reek of pitch. Eyes sting, lungs protest, and still the cold reigns. Some researchers believe that constant smoke exposure may have worsened respiratory ailments, compounding the castle's damp conditions. Others argue that people adapted quickly, scarcely noticing the haze after years of exposure. The debate lingers like the soot above your head. You wander toward a row of candles, their wax pooling downward in uneven rivulets. The tiny flames shiver when the draft sneaks in, reminding you how fragile this technology was. Imagine servants scurrying with trays of candles, trimming wicks, replacing spent stubs. The work was endless, a cycle of flame that never quite conquered the dark. In some courts, servants lit as many as 500 candles before a banquet, a spectacle meant to awe visiting dignitaries. And still, despite the dazzling display, guests huddled in cloaks, their shoulders hunched against the gnawing cold. The light deceives you. It paints golden patterns on the stone, makes pewter plates gleam faintly, yet it has no body. Hold your hands near a torch, and you feel a momentary wave of heat, gone the instant you step aside. This is not warmth but illusion, a shimmering lie in orange and gold. You close your eyes for a moment, listening to the crackle of pitch. The sound mimics a hearth but carries no promise. Your skin prickles not from heat but from the same relentless chill that has stalked you since entering. You open your eyes again, and for a moment you wonder how many people centuries ago sat under these same lights, wishing them to be something they could never become. A peculiar custom comes to mind. In certain castles of Italy, glass vessels filled with oil were lit instead of candles, producing a cleaner, steadier flame. Some travelers claimed these lamps seemed almost magical. Yet, ironically, oil lamps were said to attract more insects in summer, leaving residents swatting at moths and beetles even as the cold persisted. Innovations came, but none solved the fundamental problem. Light and heat rarely traveled together. You step back, watching the torches hiss as a new log is added to the hearth. The flames leap, shadows scatter, but the cold stays rooted in the stones, immovable, patient, everlasting. The light fills your eyes, but not your body. It is both a comfort and a mockery. Tonight, as in centuries past, the castle remains brilliant to look upon, yet unlivable to endure. You wander from the hall into a service passage, and the sound of hurried footsteps reaches your ears. A cluster of servants rushes past, arms laden with trays and bundles of wood. Their breath puffs into the air like pale smoke, even indoors. You pause to watch them, and for a moment you realize that if lords and ladies suffered from the cold, then those beneath them fared far worse. It is firmly recorded in wage rolls and inventories that most servants owned only 1 or 2 sets of clothing, usually rough wool or hemp. Many went barefoot indoors, not from choice but necessity. Their soles hardened from years of contact with icy floors, though chroniclers occasionally mention raw cracks bleeding after long nights. Imagine scrubbing the stone flags in this climate, your knees pressed against damp straw, your body shivering as water from the bucket turned to slush before the chore was done. You picture the castle's kitchen maids. They linger closest to the hearth, yet even they do not escape the cold. Their hands blister from alternating between scalding pots and icy air. An inventory from a northern manor lists gloves for scullions, suggesting at least some masters recognized the toll, but such kindness was rare. More often, complaints about servants moving too slowly in the cold appear in household records, the human suffering buried beneath a noble's impatience. A curious anecdote survives from France. One steward reprimanded his staff for lingering too long by the fire, fearing they wasted time. Yet in the same entry, he notes that 2 boys collapsed from frostbite that same week. The contradiction is painful to imagine, a reminder of how merciless both stone and master could be. You turn a corner and see a girl carrying a jug of ale, her feet bare on the freezing floor. The jug trembles, not from weight but from her shivering hands. You realize then that cold respected no rank, but poverty deepened its bite. A noble might at least gather cloaks, furs, or hot bricks at night. A servant, by contrast, relied on little more than breath and endurance. Scholars still debate how many servants truly lived within the castle versus those lodged in outer buildings. Some argue that permanent indoor staff numbered only a few dozen, making the chill survivable. Others insist that winter swelled the ranks, with villagers seeking refuge in the lord's walls. Both views leave unanswered questions, but all agree. Wherever they slept, comfort was a rarity. The human toll becomes clearer when you recall how frequently illness is mentioned in estate rolls. Payments for physicians attending to coughing maidens or ointment for frostbitten boys recur in the margins of accounts. These tiny notes, preserved by accident, testify to suffering as vivid as any chronicle. And still, work went on. Bread had to be baked, halls swept, animals tended. Cold or not, life under stone left no pause. You follow another group into the hall, where they set down trenchers of bread. Their faces are red from exertion, noses dripping, eyes bleary with exhaustion. The nobility will eat heartily tonight, while the staff gnaws stale crusts in some dark corner. You wonder, do they dream of warmth at all, or only of making it to spring alive? There's an odd note in a Venetian traveller's diary. He claimed that servants in one German castle huddled in the stables at night, pressed between horses, because the beasts gave more warmth than the lord's hearth. Whether true or exaggerated, the image lingers. Human bodies borrowing heat from animals, both species united in quiet survival. As you watch a servant boy scurry across the floor, his bare feet slapping stone, you feel your own toes curl inside your boots. The chill you've endured so far was luxury compared to his. He disappears into shadow, and you are left with the thought that castles were not built for human comfort, but for power, display, and defense. For those who kept them running, the nights were long, hard, and endlessly cold. You leave the servants behind and make your way toward the chambers reserved for nobility. If anywhere in this fortress might provide true comfort, it should be here. The carved doors, the rich fabrics, The canopies over beds, everything suggests luxury. And yet, the moment you step into one of these rooms, you discover the truth. Even for lords and ladies, the cold never yielded. It is well documented in household letters that noble families slept under mountains of bedding. Layers of woolen blankets, fur throws, and even feather mattresses were piled high, transforming beds into fortresses within the fortress. One countess wrote of sleeping beneath 7 coverings and still shivering. The words echo now as you gaze at the massive bed before you, its curtains drawn tight to form a miniature chamber within the larger room. You step closer and notice frost glistening on the inside of the window glass where there is glass at all. In poorer castles, oiled cloth or wooden shutters substituted, letting drafts creep in more easily. The floor beneath your feet feels no warmer here than in the great hall. Nobility may have had servants to light fires in their hearths, but the flames often died in the night, leaving them as vulnerable as anyone else. A peculiar tale from a French chateau recounts that nobles sometimes invited dogs into bed, not for affection alone but for warmth. Lapdogs, bred small enough to fit under covers, earned their keep by acting as living hot water bottles. This curious custom makes you smile briefly, though the humour fades when you imagine how desperate it must have felt on a night when frost rimmed the inside of the chamber. But not all scholars agree on just how miserable nobles truly were. Some argue that their access to featherbeds, fur and braziers offered meaningful relief. Others counter that even with these luxuries, noble complaints are constant in surviving correspondence. Both sides present evidence, and the truth, as always, likely lies in between. Comfort was relative, but misery was universal. You picture the lord of the castle lying under heavy blankets, velvet nightcap pulled low, whispering for his steward to fetch yet another fur. He may have wealth, power, and an army at his command, but against the cold stone, he is no stronger than you. In fact, letters from bishops and dukes alike grumble with the same weary phrases. The night is endless, the chill unbearable. My joints ache as if turned to ice. These complaints cut across rank, a reminder that frost spared no title. The canopy curtains draw your attention again. They hang thick, velvet or wool, designed to trap body heat in a small cocoon. You pull one aside and step within. The air is marginally stiller here, but even in this confined space the chill lingers. Your hand brushes the mattress stuffed with straw and feathers. It sags unevenly, and you imagine how lumps would press into the back of a sleeping noble. Comfort, even for the privileged, was always imperfect. One curious record mentions that some nobles preferred to sleep sitting upright, propped by pillows, because lying flat made them feel colder. Whether this was due to drafts or superstition remains uncertain. What is certain is that sleep was rarely restful. Chroniclers describe lords waking multiple times to stoke fires or call for hot stones wrapped in cloth to be slipped into the bed. Such nightly interruptions hardly suggest ease. You sit briefly on the edge of the bed, and your breath curls into the closed space like smoke. You imagine lying down, pulling layers over yourself, and still feeling the air gnaw at your cheeks. In this moment, the illusion of privilege fades. The chamber may boast tapestries, gilded candlesticks, and servants waiting beyond the door, but the essential truth remains. The castle itself is indifferent, and even the wealthiest inhabitant must beg for scraps of warmth. You stand again, stepping back into the chamber. The silence presses in, broken only by the faint rattle of the shutter as wind claws at it. The grandeur feels hollow now, a shell against forces that wealth cannot command. You realize that in this place, every night was a negotiation with cold, one in which even kings and queens rarely emerged victorious. You leave the noble chamber and drift toward a smaller room where guest beds line the wall. Here, the truth of sleep in a medieval castle becomes harder still to ignore. At first, the straw mattress looks inviting, a raised platform softened with ticking. Yet the moment you lower yourself onto it, you understand why so many chroniclers complained. The straw shifts unevenly, forming lumps that dig into your back. Worse still, You feel movement beneath you, tiny scurrying legs that remind you this bed is already occupied. Archaeological digs have revealed traces of lice, fleas, and even bedbugs embedded in preserved bedding from the period. Contemporary medical texts warn readers about creeping beasts of the night that cause itching, rash, and even fever. These weren't minor inconveniences, but accepted realities of castle life. No amount of layering or fur could fully keep them away. Servants shook mattresses in the morning, but infestations always returned, bred in the damp and darkness. You scratch at your sleeve almost instinctively, as if the knowledge alone could summon them. A peculiar tale from a noble household in Paris describes a guest who insisted on sleeping in his cloak, boots and all, to avoid direct contact with bedding. He left the next day declaring he'd rather face wolves outside than the lice within. Whether exaggerated or not, the complaint rings true in your bones as you feel the mattress crawl beneath you. The debate continues among historians. Were such infestations universal or exaggerated by disgusted travelers? Some argue that noble households change straw frequently, perhaps every few weeks. Others counter that records of straw purchases suggest less regularity, leaving beds stale for months. The truth remains hidden in fragments, but tonight you know which version you believe. You roll to one side, the chill rising from the mattress itself. Straw, after all, is no insulator. It absorbs dampness, flattens quickly, and leaves pockets of cold air that creep through your blankets. Imagine trying to drift into slumber as fleas bite and drafts snake under the covers. It is little wonder that medieval medical writers prescribed herbs like wormwood and pennyroyal, scattered in bedding to repel insects. Whether they worked or not is uncertain, though the fragrance might at least have masked the musty scent. You picture servants lugging fresh straw up narrow staircases, their arms scratched and itching by the time they finished. Even then, relief was temporary. A 15th century account from a Welsh castle grumbles that fleas returned in number before the fire cooled. The inevitability of infestation became part of life, a nightly ordeal that no curtain of velvet could hide. There are odd little details that bring the reality closer. One traveller's journal from Spain notes that guests sometimes carried their own bedding, preferring familiar infestations to unfamiliar ones. Another record describes visitors demanding to see straw replaced before they lay down, a request likely ignored once the steward's back was turned. You can almost hear the muttered curses of a tired servant forced to scatter herbs yet again, knowing full well it would change nothing. As you shift on the mattress, you feel how little comfort it offers. Your shoulders ache from the lumps, your skin prickles with imaginary bites, and the cold wraps around you as though the bed itself conspired against rest. You realize now why the noble chamber had curtains drawn tight privacy. Yes, but also a desperate attempt to create a cocoon within which the insects and drafts might be slightly less relentless. You lie still for a moment, breathing in the musty air, and it dawns on you. Sleep here is not recovery but compromise. Every hour gained is a bargain struck between fatigue and discomfort. Those who lived in castles endured this bargain night after night, year after year, until it simply became the rhythm of life. You rise from the bed at last, brushing straw from your cloak. The scurrying sensation lingers on your skin, phantom itches that will not fade quickly. Behind you, the mattress lies waiting for its next victim, as indifferent as the stones surrounding it. Comfort was never the castle's gift. It offered protection, prestige, and permanence, but never an easy night's sleep. You step away from the straw mattress, brushing at your arms as though the crawling sensation still lingers. Across the chamber, another bed waits, its frame hung with heavy linen sheets and scratchy woolen blankets. You tug one corner back and notice the texture immediately. Coarse, stiff, rough enough to redden your knuckles. This was medieval sleepwear's constant companion. The people who lived in castles did not slip into fleece pajamas or soft cotton. They stripped to linen shirts or shifts, garments that might feel airy in summer, but in winter turned icy against the skin. It is confirmed in countless wills and household inventories that linen was the foundation of medieval wardrobes. It absorbed sweat and oils, acting as a buffer beneath heavier wool. Yet its thin weave made it a poor defense against cold nights. You pull the shirt over your head, feeling how quickly the fabric wicks away the little warmth you've gathered. The fibers scratch, the seams chafe, and you shiver as though wrapped in frost. Curious details about medieval sleep habits survive in letters and poems. Some nobles preferred to wear multiple layers, even in bed: long tunics, cloaks, and fur-lined slippers. Others, guided by superstition, believed sleeping unclothed allowed the body to breathe more freely. You picture the scene. One chamber where a man snores beneath a mountain of layers, another where a woman lies bare under quilts, each certain their method is best. The contrast is almost comical, though both likely suffered just the same. Modern researchers remain divided on whether medieval people truly considered beds a place of rest or more of a nightly ordeal. Diaries hint at restless tossing, constant interruptions, and early rising out of necessity. Medical treatises from the period advise drinking warm wine before sleep or placing heated stones beneath the blankets. The advice suggests what the evidence confirms: cold was an adversary every bit as troublesome as lice or drafts. You lie back for a moment, the linen shirt clinging unpleasantly to your skin, the woolen blanket above scratches like brambles. Imagine trying to drift into slumber with such textures pressing into every inch of you. No wonder lullabies of the era often mention prayers for warmth. One old French rhyme pleads for angels to wrap the child in their wings, a poetic cry for insulation when blankets failed. There are odd anecdotes, too. In some castles, servants reportedly warmed noble garments by wearing them themselves during the day, returning them to their masters filled with the faint heat of their own bodies. One can only imagine the mixture of gratitude and discomfort such an arrangement provoked. Elsewhere, accounts mention nobles keeping geese in chambers, their feathers plucked gradually to stuff pillows, while the birds themselves provided a living heater. Whether entirely accurate or not, these details reveal a desperation that seems both resourceful and absurd. The debate over comfort remains open. Did nobles truly believe their linen shifts sufficient, or did they merely endure for lack of alternatives? Some historians suggest that layering cloaks atop bedding offered significant warmth, while others argue that the weight crushed more than it comforted. The uncertainty lingers, like the persistent itch of wool at your shoulders. You imagine lying there through long winter nights, the linen shirt damp with sweat where it meets the cold, the blankets heavy yet inadequate. Your breath would cloud above you, each exhale proof that the air inside your bed remained frigid, and each time you stirred, the sheets would slip, letting a draft snake across your skin. Sleep, in such a setting, was less about rest and more about surrender. At last you rise, tugging the garment away from your body. It clings stubbornly before peeling off, leaving your skin clammy. You drop it onto the bed with distaste, realizing that even the simplest of comforts, a soft shirt, a warm blanket, were luxuries this castle could not grant. The people who lived here wore their hardship to bed each night, their rest as rough as the fabrics on their skin. You rub your arms against the chill, and your eyes are drawn once more to the heavy curtains that hang around the bed frame. Their folds reach from canopy to floor, enclosing the mattress like a miniature room within a room. At first you imagine luxury velvet, brocade, silks, but when you step closer, you feel the truth. The cloth is thick, yes, but also stiff, damp at the hem, its edges frayed where moths have nibbled. The curtain sways slightly, moved by a draught that somehow still finds its way inside. It is well attested in inventories and estate rolls that bed curtains were a staple of noble households. They served as privacy screens, status symbols, and practical barriers against drafts. Wealthy families invested fortunes in them, stitched from wool, linen, or even imported fabrics dyed rich colors. Yet despite the cost, their effectiveness was limited. Curtains trapped breath and body heat, but they also trapped dampness, leaving the air stale and clammy by dawn. You draw the curtain closed and step inside. The air is stiller, muffled from the rest of the chamber. At first it feels reassuring, like being wrapped in a cocoon, but soon you notice the faint scent of mildew, and the heaviness of the fabric itself seems to press the cold closer rather than keep it away. Imagine lying here, your nose chilled, your ears stinging, while curtains sway faintly each time the wind moans through the shutters. Odd details about such beds crop up in chronicles. In one Flemish account, a guest described condensation freezing along the inside of curtains so that by morning frost clung like lace to the fabric. Another story tells of servants creeping into a lord's chamber to light candles, finding him buried beneath layers of furs with curtains pulled so tight that he resembled a corpse in a shroud. The image is eerie, and yet perfectly captures the desperation of winter nights in stone rooms. Scholars remain divided over how effective these enclosures truly were. Some architectural historians suggest they offered a real microclimate, raising the temperature by several degrees. Others argue that the constant drafts and porous materials rendered them little more than psychological comfort. Without thermometers, medieval people had only their bodies to testify, and their endless complaints speak volumes. You brush your fingers against the fabric. It feels cold, as though it has absorbed the stone's very essence. You try to imagine sleeping within this enclosure. The curtains might block a stray draft, but the weight of the air inside would soon feel suffocating. And if you shifted in the night, a gap would open, letting icy tendrils of wind slip in like unwelcome fingers. There are peculiar customs connected to these curtains too. In some noble households, guests were offered beds with their curtains already drawn tight, a gesture of courtesy that also ensured servants could not spy upon them. Elsewhere, curtains became stages for superstition. Prayers were sewn into their hems, or small relics were pinned to the folds in hopes of warding off illness. One curious inventory even lists amulets against frost tucked into the lining. Whether these worked or not, the faith invested in fabric shows how fragile comfort truly was. As you stand within the dim enclosure, your breath clouds in the half-dark. The air feels trapped, still, heavy with a damp that settles into your lungs. You realize that warmth here was never pure. It was always mixed with mustiness, with the stale tang of unwashed fabric, with the faint scratch of moth-eaten edges. A cocoon, yes, but one that promised as much suffocation as shelter. You push the curtain aside and step back into the wider chamber. The draught greets you instantly, brushing your cheek like an icy hand, and strangely, you feel relief. Better the honest cold of the open air than the false comfort of a cloth prison. You look back once more at the swaying curtains, and you understand why noble letters so often complain. The bed was meant to be a refuge, but even wrapped in costly fabric, it could never escape the truth of stone. You leave the suffocating curtains behind and wander once more toward the hall. Tonight happens to be a feast night, or at least the castle pretends at celebration. Long trestle tables stretch from end to end, groaning beneath platters of roasted meat, trenchers of bread, and jugs of ale. Candles scatter a shaky glow across the scene, and the air fills with the smell of spiced wine and dripping fat. At first glance, it should feel warm, but as you sit down among the benches, you discover the same truth as before. The cold is unrelenting. Chroniclers left ample records of such banquets. They tell of whole boars roasted, pies stuffed with birds, even elaborate dishes gilded with gold leaf to impress guests. Yet almost every description also mentions frost visible on the walls, or diners breathing mist into the air as they lifted their goblets. Archaeological evidence even shows that some castle dining halls were built with drains directly into the floor, so spilled wine and food could be washed away, an efficient system, but one that also let icy air and damp seep upward all through the night. You glance across the hall and see guests wrapped in cloaks, even as they gnaw at drumsticks. Their laughter rings, but their shoulders hunch. Their fingers twitch for warmth between bites. You notice a servant rushing past with a tray of steaming stew, The steam rises beautifully but vanishes the moment it hits the air, swallowed by the cavernous draught. A curious detail survives in a 15th century German poem. It describes a banquet where the Lord apologized to his guests because icicles hung from the rafters overhead. Rather than cancel the feast, they pressed on, drinking hot wine in an attempt to ignore the obvious. The poet notes with dry humor that we feasted under winter's teeth. Whether exaggerated or not, the detail makes you glance upward now, half expecting to see the same glittering stalactites overhead. But how much did these feasts truly distract from the cold? Some historians argue that the alcohol, noise, and companionship provided enough warmth in spirit to overcome discomfort. Others remain skeptical, pointing to constant noble complaints that even mid-banquet their fingers stiffened around knives. The debate continues, but tonight you can see both sides. The laughter is genuine, yet every chuckle sends a misty plume into the air like smoke from a chimney. You sip from a goblet of wine, its spiced aroma filling your nose. For a moment it burns warmly down your throat. Then, almost mockingly, the heat evaporates, leaving you no less chilled than before. Across the table, a woman sneezes into her sleeve. Another coughs quietly, both reminders of how gatherings like this often spread illness faster than cheer. Still, no one leaves. The feast is ritual as much as nourishment, and the performance must continue. Odd customs surface in your mind. In some regions, nobles instructed servants to place bowls of glowing embers beneath the tables during winter feasts, hoping to warm the guests' feet. A diary from Burgundy notes that the bowls often smoked too much, leaving guests coughing instead of thawed. Another account mentions straw scattered near benches, supposedly to insulate against the icy floor. Whether it worked or not, the attempt shows just how desperate people were to cheat the cold for a single evening. You tear a hunk of bread, its crust hard from the draught, and chew slowly. The flavor is good, but you can't help noticing the way your jaw trembles from chill as you bite. Around you, the hall swells with noise. Laughter, clinking cups, dogs barking as they beg beneath the tables. The scene is lively, yet beneath it lies a constant undercurrent. The sound of wind moaning through arrow slits, the quiet whistle of draughts along the stone floor. You realize that the banquet, for all its abundance, is less about comfort and more about defiance. The Lord hosts not because the hall is warm, but because the hall is cold, and he means to prove that the castle still thrives despite it. The feast is a performance, a declaration that life continues even when frost presses its face against the walls. But as you sit there, shoulders tense, fingers aching, you know the truth. The laughter will fade, the candles will gutter, and when silence returns, the cold will still be waiting. You set down your goblet, watching the steam curl briefly from the last of the hot wine. It swirls, dissolves, and disappears, much like the illusion of warmth this feast offers. The hall is full, the tables crowded, yet deep inside you know, everyone here is united not by merriment, but by endurance. And endurance in a medieval castle is the only banquet truly served. You sit back from the banquet table, belly full but body still trembling. Someone presses a goblet into your hand, its surface sticky with condensation. The liquid inside glimmers amber, rich with spices. You raise it to your lips, and the warmth of wine trickles down your throat like liquid fire. For a moment, relief spreads through your chest. But then, as you lean against the bench, you feel the truth. The warmth is fleeting, replaced quickly by a deeper chill that seems to crawl closer now that your body has been fooled. It is firmly noted in medieval medical texts that alcohol was believed to kindle the humours and restore balance. Physicians prescribed mulled wine with cinnamon and cloves as remedies against winter ailments. Yet the irony was clear even then. Alcohol dilates blood vessels, bringing heat to the skin but lowering core temperature. Contemporary accounts reveal this contradiction. Guests describing themselves flushed and sweating at the table, then staggering away shivering more fiercely than before. You picture nights after long hunts, raising tankards of ale to stave off the frost. For a few minutes laughter grew louder, faces turned ruddy. But by midnight, letters described them stumbling to bed, chilled to the marrow. One chronicler even warned against false fire of the vine, a phrase that lingers now as you sip your own goblet. The heat is a lie, a brief curtain drawn across the unchanging cold. Odd stories abound. In one English household, a steward recorded that a servant boy froze to death after falling asleep in a courtyard, drunk on ale. The entry is grim, but it illustrates the danger. Alcohol felt like protection until it betrayed the drinker. Another anecdote tells of nobles demanding heated wine before bed, convinced it would ensure warm dreams. Whether they slept better or simply drifted into stupor, the practice reveals the desperation of their nights. Scholars continue to debate how central drink was to enduring winter in castles. Some argue that constant supply of ale and wine far greater than water was a deliberate response to climate. Others contend it was more cultural than practical, a habit born of festivity rather than survival. Both views find evidence in records, leaving us to imagine men and women clutching goblets as though their very lives depended on them. You finish your cup and set it down. Already you feel the edges of your body cool, the warmth gone, leaving only clammy skin. You watch as others around you refill, their cheeks flushed, their laughter booming. The illusion binds them together, a collective trick of the senses. You find it both sad and strangely noble, an act of defiance, a refusal to surrender, even if the method betrays them. There are quirks to this culture of drink. Spiced wine was often served piping hot, ladled from cauldrons where steam rolled upward. Some lords imported exotic spices at enormous expense, saffron and nutmeg carried across continents. Guests marveled at the flavor, but what they sought most was the fleeting warmth. In contrast, poorer folk drank ale at nearly every meal, its low alcohol content safer than water but still carrying that deceptive flush. You imagine yourself leaning against a stone wall, the firelight flickering, the wine a fading ember in your stomach. Outside, the night howls, wind prowling through slits and cracks. You understand now why so many medieval songs and poems praised drink as salvation. It was not simply joy, it was survival theatre, each sip an attempt to cheat the castle's indifference. And yet, the deception is cruel. You draw your cloak tighter, realizing that your hands shake more now than before the wine. The warmth has left, leaving you weaker, your body's reserve sapped by the false comfort. This was the rhythm of countless nights, a cup of solace, a burst of laughter, followed by the long, bitter hours until dawn. You close your eyes briefly, listening to the hall. Cups clatter, voices rise, torches hiss. Beneath it all lies the steady hum of cold, patient, and victorious. Wine may fight, ale may distract, but the stone does not care. The castle swallows both heat and hope alike. You open your eyes again, staring into your empty goblet. It glimmers faintly in the candlelight, a reminder of warmth already gone. The feast dwindles at last. Candles sputter low, benches scrape, and the hall grows quieter as nobles retreat to their chambers. You follow the trickle of servants clearing the tables, stepping past overturned trenchers and bones tossed to the hounds. The merriment is over, and what remains is silence and cold, heavier now that the noise no longer masks it. You pause near a sideboard where jugs of water have been left for the night. One catches your eye. Its surface glimmers strangely, not with condensation but with frost. You reach out, touch the clay, and feel it biting cold. The liquid inside is not liquid at all. The jug has frozen solid, its contents transformed into a pale block of ice. This, you realize, is the truest sign of the castle's indifference. Even indoors, water refuses to remain water. Contemporary letters confirm such details. One noblewoman in York complained in midwinter that the pitcher in my chamber cracketh with frost. Another account from Bohemia records that servants broke ice from basins before washing the lord's hands at breakfast. Archaeological digs in castle wells show evidence of stone linings chipped by frost, proof that even underground storage was not safe from the season's grip. You lift the jug carefully, surprised at its weight. Imagine reaching for water in the middle of the night, lips parched, only to find the cup filled with shards of ice. Chronicles mention people resorting to sucking on snow indoors, an absurd yet believable image. A curious anecdote from Burgundy tells of a guest who demanded wine instead of water at night, insisting, "The frost cannot seize the vine." He woke to find even his goblet stiff with frozen slush. Scholars debate how common this freezing truly was. Some argue that only northern castles suffered such extremes, while others point to evidence that even southern strongholds reported frost on the inside of windows. Climate fluctuations, the so-called Little Ice Age, likely made winters harsher than many imagine. The exact degree is still contested, but the testimonies of frozen pitchers stand as chilling reminders. You set the jug down and breathe onto your fingers, watching your own mist swirl in the lamplight. Water turns to ice, breath turns to cloud. Even your body seems determined to betray you. You understand now why warm drinks were prized at night, why spiced wine and mulled ale became more than luxuries they were. Necessities, the only way to escape the humiliation of frozen jugs. The silence of the hall grows thicker. You hear only the faint creak of shutters as wind presses at them, and the occasional bark of a dog settling by the dying hearth. You imagine noble families climbing into their curtained beds, servants curling on straw pallets, each hoping that morning comes before thirst does. There are odd survival tricks noted in scattered documents. Some households dropped hot stones into buckets of water to keep them liquid overnight, though by morning the stones cooled and the ice claimed them anyway. Others wrapped jugs in blankets, an image at once practical and absurd, bundling clay as though it were a child. One traveller mocked the practice, writing that the jars are swaddled better than the infants. Still, the attempt speaks volumes. You glance again at the frozen jug. Its surface glitters in the fading candlelight, a cruel reminder that even the simplest human need water was a struggle here. The castle gave shelter from enemies, but not from the night. You turn away, throat dry, knowing there will be no drink until morning fires are lit and the ice broken free. As you move toward the stairwell, the cold seems sharper, almost triumphant. The jug remains behind on the table, silent and solid, a monument to the castle's power over comfort. And you, like every soul who lived here centuries ago, are left to endure the long hours of thirst in a place where even water will not flow. You climb the stair again, this time toward the upper chambers where servants sleep. The passage is narrow, the air sharper, and your breath echoes in hollow puffs. When you push open a small door, you enter a cramped loft where straw pallets line the floor. The first thing you notice is not sound but silence, broken only by muffled coughs and the soft shuffle of bodies huddling together. The second thing you notice is their hands. Fingers curled tight, knuckles red, some mottled with the pallor of frostbite. It is well documented in manor accounts that frostbite and chilblains plagued the lower classes in winter. Physicians of the time described red sores upon the toes and ears, a phrase that seems gentle compared to the reality of cracked, swollen flesh. Archaeological studies of skeletal remains reveal signs of repeated cold exposure, damage etched into bones long after flesh was gone. Tonight, as you look upon these sleeping forms, you realize those findings are not abstract. They are embodied here, in the curled shapes of exhausted servants. A boy shifts in his sleep, pulling a ragged blanket higher. The fabric is too thin, its edges frayed. You see his toes protrude, raw against the air. Imagine waking in the morning, unable to move your fingers well enough to carry trays or polish armor. And yet, they did. Letters from noble households mention boys too stiff to serve, and the casual phrasing shows how common the problem was. The cold maimed, but work continued. There are curious and sometimes tragic anecdotes. One tale from a Bavarian castle describes a maid whose fingers blackened during a brutal frost. Rather than dismiss her, the lady of the house tasked her with tending fires, believing the heat would restore them. Instead, the girl lost several fingers within weeks. Another record notes servants wearing layers of rags around their feet, so thick they could scarcely walk, yet still the cold gnawed through. Scholars remain divided on how widespread these injuries were. Some argue they were occasional, exaggerated in tales for pity or drama. Others contend they were endemic, part of the invisible toll of medieval winters. Both positions find evidence, but the sight before you, the pale hands, the coughing children, makes the harsher view more believable. You notice a dog curled among the servants, its fur a patch of warmth in the straw. The boy beside it presses close, sharing breath with the animal. This image echoes peculiar practices mentioned in chronicles. Peasants and servants often slept beside livestock for heat. Calves, dogs, even pigs shared chambers, their body warmth precious in ways fur cloaks could never match. The arrangement may sound crude, but survival often island. The smell in the loft is sour, damp straw, unwashed clothes, faint mildew. You realize that frostbite was only one danger. Infections spread easily in such conditions. Medical texts of the time mention rot of the extremities as a feared outcome, and you understand why. Without antibiotics, even a blister could fester into something fatal. And yet, despite this, life continued. You see a girl sit up briefly, rub her hands together, and lie down again with hardly a groan. The resilience is striking, a quiet acceptance carved into these people by necessity. They endured because there was no other choice. You draw your cloak tighter, but the sight of those hands and feet stays with you. Each shiver you feel now, each numb fingertip, is a faint shadow of what they lived with nightly. The castle spared them from raiders, yes, but exacted its price in frostbitten flesh. You step back into the stairwell, leaving the loft behind. The coughs linger in your ears, the image of red knuckles etched in your mind. The night stretches on, and you carry with you the knowledge that the cold was not merely uncomfortable, it was cruel, carving itself into bodies as surely as chisels carved the stone. You descend from the loft, your thoughts heavy with the image of frostbitten hands. The air grows colder still as you follow a narrow passage to a small door tucked into the wall. When you push it open, a sharp wave of icy air strikes your face. This is the castle Privy, an architectural marvel for its time, yet a nightly ordeal for anyone desperate enough to use it. The chamber is little more than a stone alcove jutting from the wall, with a wooden seat built over a vertical shaft. You step closer and hear the faint rush of wind spiraling upward. The opening beneath connects straight down to a chute, and beyond that, sometimes to the moat or a pit below. In summer, the smell alone would drive you away. In winter, the problem is worse. The cold climbs the shaft like a predator, icy drafts swirling through the hole to bite at anyone seated above. Contemporary accounts remark often on the misery of these privies. A nobleman in England once wrote to his steward complaining that the seat itself is frost. Another described the sensation as sitting upon winter's teeth. Archaeological evidence of latrine shafts confirms their openness to the elements. For all their ingenuity, they were chimneys of cold. You lower yourself cautiously, cloak wrapped tight. The wood feels like iron against your skin. Within seconds your legs tremble, not from exertion but from exposure. Imagine enduring this in the middle of the night, half asleep, body vulnerable. The very thought makes your stomach twist, as though thirst or hunger would be preferable to this ritual humiliation. Odd anecdotes abound. In one German castle, it was said that servants warmed privy seats with heated bricks before their lord used them, a gesture of both loyalty and pity. In Scotland, a chronicler describes a guest who refused to use the privy in winter, instead demanding a chamber pot beside his bed. The pot froze solid before morning, forcing servants to chip away at the contents with iron rods. Scholars remain uncertain how frequently privies were used at night. Some argue that chamber pots were the norm after dark, while privies were reserved for daylight. Others contend that nobles, particularly in large households, insisted on using the built structures regardless of hour. Both interpretations find evidence, and tonight you can see why the debate persists. Either option was miserable. You glance at the wooden door, its planks warped, unable to seal the chamber from the draught. The wind howls softly through the slit, carrying the scent of damp stone and something fouler. You realize now why servants dreaded this duty. Emptying, cleaning, maintaining. It was not merely unclean, it was unbearable in winter. And yet, this was necessity. Nature does not respect castles or kings. Every inhabitant, from lord to scullion, faced the same nightly choice: brave the frozen privy, or endure the indignity of a chamber pot that might freeze beside the bed. Both options robbed dignity, and both underscored the same truth: you would not last a night here without confronting discomfort on the most basic level. You step away quickly, shivering as you pull the door closed. The draught follows you into the corridor, whistling faintly through the cracks. For a moment you pause, leaning against the wall, heart beating fast as though you had faced an enemy. And perhaps you did. The castle, in its own quiet way, makes enemies of its very conveniences. You walk on, the sound of wind still in your ears. The privy fades behind you, but its memory clings, a reminder that even the smallest act of relief could feel like punishment in these walls. Here, there is no escape. Even privacy carries a chill sharper than any blade. You pull your cloak tighter as you leave the privy behind, stepping back into the corridor where torches sputter faintly. The thought strikes you that in a medieval castle, you never truly escaped the cold, not even indoors, not even in the heart of the Lord's Hall. Everywhere the air lingered, it found a way to sneak through cracks, windows, and stones. And so, people did the only thing they could. They carried their defences on their shoulders. Cloaks were the great equalizers. Nobles wore them embroidered, trimmed with fur, dyed in rich hues. Servants wore theirs plain, coarse, sometimes little more than patched rags. But everyone clutched a cloak tightly around themselves, even when moving from one room to another. Illuminated manuscripts frequently depict men and women indoors with hoods raised, as though each chamber were an outdoor street. That detail, so easily overlooked in paintings, tells its own quiet truth. You draw your own cloak tighter, the hood shadowing your face. The fabric feels heavy but not protective enough. The wind still snakes in, curling around your ankles and teasing your ears. Imagine sitting at a noble's table, goblet in one hand and the other buried in your cloak, trying to eat with stiff fingers. Chronicles often describe lords conducting business with mantle drawn close, a phrase that captures the perpetual chill better than any architectural study. There are curious accounts of how cloaks were used. In one French court, noblewomen lined their cloaks with ermine tails, both for display and insulation. In harsher climates, men wore cloaks so long they dragged across the floor, doubling as makeshift blankets when they sat down. Servants, lacking such luxuries, sometimes stitched together scraps of old wool into mismatched wraps. The odd appearance drew laughter, yet it was survival. Historians still puzzle over whether cloaks were truly effective against the drafts. Some argue that wool's natural oils repelled dampness and trapped heat effectively. Others insist that cloaks provided little more than psychological comfort, their insulation overwhelmed by constant air movement. The surviving garments in museums are too fragile to test, leaving us to guess much as you guessed tonight. You step into a side chamber, where a cluster of men huddle together, cloaks wrapped like cocoons. Their breath clouds mingle, rising toward the rafters. One man pulls his hood so low you see only his nose. Another tucks his hands inside the folds, rocking back and forth. They look like travelers waiting in a snowstorm, yet they are inside the castle itself. The irony deepens when you recall that cloaks were also symbols of status. Colors, linings, and trims declared wealth. Yet what use was ermine against a draught that sliced straight through? Let us survive where nobles boast of their fine mantles, then, in the same breath, complain of bones made brittle by frost. Wealth may have purchased beauty, but it could not purchase comfort. Odd anecdotes surface here too. In one northern household, guests were issued extra cloaks for the night, as though they were blankets. Another record notes that soldiers on guard were ordered to share cloaks 2 at a time, each wrapping half around themselves during long watches. Picture 2 weary men pressed shoulder to shoulder, bound together by wool, waiting for dawn. It is a strange human image of dignity surrendered to survival. You tug your own cloak tighter still, but the truth becomes clear. The garment is no shield. It is a token, a gesture, a reminder that in this fortress, even clothing is a battle fought nightly. The air gnaws at you regardless, creeping through seams, chilling your skin beneath the wool. You step back into the corridor, the cloak heavy around your shoulders. Each movement swishes fabric across the floor, the sound mingling with the castle's whispers. You realize that cloaks were not merely garments but companions, carried everywhere like loyal dogs, drawn close in every hall, chapel, and chamber. And still, for all their presence, they were never enough. The torch beside you gutters, sending sparks against the wall. You pull your hood further forward and walk on, aware that even wrapped in layers, you remain prey to the castle's breath. In this place, warmth is not won, it is borrowed, briefly, until the stone reclaims it. The corridor narrows and turns, and before long you find yourself before another heavy wooden door. When you push it open, the sound of low chanting meets your ears, echoing softly against stone. You have stumbled into the castle's chapel, where flickering candles illuminate a vaulted ceiling. At first, the sight might soothe you, faith carved into stone, warm light on painted saints, but then you kneel, and the cold strikes again with merciless clarity. The floor is unyielding, smooth slabs of stone worn by centuries of knees. You lower yourself cautiously, and instantly the chill seeps upward, numbing your shins. Imagine devout men and women, morning and night, kneeling here through long prayers. Contemporary accounts confirm that worship continued regardless of season, for devotion was seen as armor against discomfort. And yet, many letters confess to numb hands clasped in prayer, or voices trembling not from reverence but from shivering. You shift uncomfortably, feeling the air swirl through the chapel. Narrow lancet windows allow only a trickle of light, but their cracks invite endless draughts. Candles tremble under the invisible intrusion, their wax dripping onto already chilled stone. Even the altar cloth seems to shiver, its embroidered fringe stirring with every gust. Curious customs reveal themselves in scattered chronicles. In one German castle, parishioners were said to hold warmed bricks beneath their cloaks during winter mass, shuffling them between hands and laps as prayers stretched on. In another account, nobles demanded shorter services during harsh winters, a compromise between piety and survival. Whether these tales are exaggerated or not, they capture the tension between ritual and bodily endurance. The smell here is distinctive, a mingling of incense, tallow smoke, and damp stone. You breathe it in, the sweetness of frankincense fighting with the mildew of walls. For a moment, you wonder if the incense was not only symbolic but practical, masking the odor of wet stone and unwashed bodies. Some researchers argue that the use of heavy incense in winter had less to do with theology and more to do with combating foul air. Others dismiss this theory as anachronistic. The debate continues, leaving the truth as hazy as the smoke curling now before your eyes. You glance at the figures kneeling nearby, cloaks drawn close, hoods shadowing faces. They sway gently as words murmur through lips gone pale with cold. Their devotion is impressive, yet you see the subtle tremors in their fingers. Prayer here is not serene but a battle, each whispered hymn carried on breath that turns instantly to mist. One peculiar anecdote survives from a French abbey, where it was said monks slept in the chapel itself to show humility. They lined against the walls, cloaked, their bodies pressed to icy stone all night. The chronicler who recorded it admitted, almost sheepishly, that half the monks coughed through the next morning's service. Whether this was holy fervour or folly remains uncertain, but it illustrates the strange overlap of faith and frost. As you remain kneeling, your own legs begin to ache, not from posture but from the cold chewing upward through bone. You shift, but the discomfort only follows. You realize then that devotion here was as much physical endurance as spiritual exercise. To pray in such a place was to surrender not just time but warmth, to offer pain alongside piety. The chant continues, low and steady, echoing into the rafters where shadows gather like silent witnesses. You close your eyes and let the sound wash over you. For a moment, the repetition feels soothing. Then your teeth chatter, breaking the rhythm. You open your eyes again, reminded that even in the holiest chamber, the castle never softened. You rise at last, legs stiff, knees throbbing. The figures remain kneeling, steadfast, their murmurs unwavering. You step backward toward the door, pulling your cloak tight. Faith may have guided them, but cold carved itself into every prayer. You leave the chapel with the scent of incense still clinging to your cloak, mixed now with the memory of stone too frozen to ignore. You return to the corridor, footsteps echoing in the hush, and the cough you carried from the damp loft lingers in your throat. It scratches, stubborn and sharp, as though the castle itself has slipped its fingers into your lungs. You press on, but you know illness was always the shadow that followed cold. In winter, fevers spread as predictably as frost. Contemporary records speak often of winter agues, a vague term covering everything from influenza to pneumonia. Physicians of the era described chests heavy with phlegm and throats tightened by icy humours. They recommended bleeding, hot poultices, or draughts of spiced wine. None of these cured the chill. At best, they distracted from it. Modern medical historians debate how much the castle's climate contributed to waves of plague and pestilence. Some argue the damp and draughts weakened immune systems, leaving bodies vulnerable. Others insist the real culprit lay in poor sanitation and malnutrition, with the cold merely compounding misery. Either way, illness was constant company. You stop by a window slit, watching your breath fog and vanish. Imagine trying to recover from fever here, shivering in a chamber where even water jugs froze. One noblewoman's letter describes wrapping her child in 3 layers of wool, only to wake and find the boy blue about the lips. Another account from Burgundy mentions servants carrying blankets to the chapel to pray over their lord's sickbed, though the stone beneath remained icy, mocking their faith. There are curious remedies scattered in chronicles. Some households placed heated bricks at the foot of the bed, then sprinkled herbs like sage or thyme, believing the vapours would ease coughs. In Italy, one physician prescribed dried toad powder mixed into wine as a cure for chills. Whether anyone was truly helped is doubtful, but desperation birthed creativity, however strange. You cough again, the sound loud in the silence. The air is sharp, scratching your lungs. You can almost taste the damp stone itself. Imagine the castle filled with dozens of such coughs, echoing through halls at night, layering like a grim chorus. This was winter's music, not the crackle of fire or the hymn of choirs, but the ragged rhythm of sickness spreading through walls too cold to resist it. Scholars often ask whether the Little Ice Age worsened these winters. Some evidence suggests colder seasons struck Europe between the 14th and 17th centuries, intensifying hardships. But debates persist. Was climate the villain, or simply the stage upon which disease already danced? The records are unclear, yet the suffering they describe is undeniable. Odd little stories bring the reality closer. A chronicler in Scotland wrote of a lord whose beard froze stiff during a fever, the condensation from his laboured breathing turning to icicles. In Germany, a diary records that servants broke ice from water meant to prepare herbal teas for the sick. Both anecdotes sound almost absurd until you stand here, breath fogging, lungs aching, realizing they are utterly plausible. You move again, down a stair toward a smaller chamber. The smell here is sour, the unmistakable scent of illness clinging to the air. You picture a patient curled beneath furs, sweat soaking into straw even as the body trembles from cold. The paradox is cruel. Fevers raged while the air itself froze. Sickness was both burning and freezing, trapped in a body fighting against the stone's indifference. And yet, people survived. They wrote letters, kept accounts, raised families within these walls. You find yourself marveling at their resilience, even as you rub your chest against the cough. Perhaps survival itself was the castle's greatest miracle, not its battlements or towers, but the stubborn endurance of those who lived here, night after night, illness after illness. You step back into the stairwell, the cough still scratching your throat. The castle exhales its damp breath around you, and you know that disease was not an intruder, but a resident, welcomed by the stone. You walk on, understanding that every shiver tonight is not only discomfort, but a reminder of centuries of frailty carved into these very walls. You make your way back toward the great hall, but before you reach it, you notice another chamber alive with muffled sounds. When you step inside, the first thing you see are animals' dogs stretched before the hearth, a goat tethered in the corner, even a small pony shifting in the straw. At first it seems absurd, livestock indoors, but then you feel the difference. The air here is warmer, just barely, as though the collective breathing of creatures has pushed the cold a little further away. Medieval records confirm what your eyes show you. Animals often shared space with humans, not only in peasant cottages but sometimes within castle walls. Dogs were constant companions, hunting hounds, lapdogs, guard dogs, and their body heat was prized almost as much as their loyalty. Chroniclers even remark on nobles allowing favoured hounds to sleep at their feet during banquets, a gesture of affection and practicality alike. You step closer to one of the dogs, its flank rising and falling with steady breath. The warmth radiates outward, subtle but real. Imagine lying with such creatures in bed, their fur against your hands, their heat a bulwark against icy draughts. A peculiar anecdote from Italy tells of noble women cradling tiny lapdogs under their gowns, calling them comforters. Another from England describes soldiers quartered with their horses, using the animals' bodies as living stoves on frigid nights. It sounds desperate because it was. Yet scholars differ on just how widespread this practice was within castles. Some argue that noble etiquette frowned upon livestock in living quarters, restricting such habits to peasants. Others point to letters and poems that casually reference animals in halls and chambers, suggesting the boundary was often blurred. The evidence is uneven, leaving modern readers to wonder whether survival simply outweighed propriety when frost pressed too close. You pause by the hearth where smoke curls lazily upward. The hounds shift closer to the embers, sighing contentedly. A servant boy slips inside, carrying a bucket of scraps. He tosses bones to the dogs, pats the goat, then curls up against the wall beside them. His eyes flutter shut almost instantly. You realize what comfort means here. Not luxury, not blankets or braziers, but the simple heat of other breathing bodies. The smell is strong fur, dung, smoke, but your nose adjusts. After all, survival has its own perfume. You think of peasant cottages described in chronicles, where families slept in single rooms with pigs and chickens scratching nearby. Archaeologists have even uncovered hut floors thick with manure layers, compacted into insulation. The image is unromantic, yet strangely ingenious. People turned animals into allies against cold, their warmth shared freely. Odd tales underline this ingenuity. In one German fortress, it's said a cow was led into the hall during a siege winter to keep the Lord's children warm at night. In another, falcons were tucked beneath covers by their handlers, prized both as hunters and as hand-warmers. Whether half-truths or exaggerations, the stories echo the same logic. In a world where stone froze and fires failed, living heat was the most reliable refuge. You crouch beside the boy now sleeping with dogs at his side. His face relaxes in slumber, breath even, hands warmed against fur. You envy him, though the floor beneath is hard and the air still cold. It seems paradoxical that comfort in a castle is found not in draped beds, but in huddles of animals and humans sharing warmth without ceremony. When you rise again, the room feels smaller, filled with soft breathing and faint rustles. The cold still lurks, but here, for once, you see it held at bay. The lesson is simple. Survival in these walls was not only about stone and fire, but about bodies, human and animal, pressing close together in the night. You step back into the corridor, the warmth fading instantly as the door closes. The cold greets you like an old enemy, sharper now, after that brief reprieve. You walk on, realizing that in a medieval castle, even companionship with beasts was a form of resistance, a reminder that warmth could be borrowed, however humbly, from the shared persistence of life. You keep walking, cloak pulled tight, the memory of hounds and straw clinging faintly to you. Yet once away from their breathing warmth, the air feels sharper than before, a knife sliding back into its sheath. You find yourself in another chamber, smaller, with low ceilings and soot-stained beams overhead. Here the air is dense with the faint aroma of heated stone. At first, you mistake it for another hearth, but then you see the trick, a row of smooth rocks laid beneath blankets on a wooden bench. Hot stones, bricks, and even embers were among the simplest and most desperate medieval tricks against the cold. Servants heated them in the kitchen fire, wrapped them in cloth, and carried them into bedchambers. They were placed at the foot of the bed, tucked under cloaks, or slipped into boots. For a short while, they radiated enough heat to trick tired bodies into thinking the night might be bearable. You crouch beside one of the stones. Its surface glows faintly, not with light but with heat. You press your palm against the cloth and feel warmth seep briefly into your skin. Within minutes, it will cool to the temperature of the room, and by dawn it will be as icy as the walls. Household accounts from across Europe list endless purchases of fuel, wood, peat, coal, partly because of these makeshift devices. Yet the records also show complaints. Bricks cracked, stones scorched bedding, sometimes even ignited straw. Curious anecdotes illustrate both ingenuity and danger. In one French castle, a servant boy reportedly set an entire mattress alight when the brick he carried was too hot. The noble family fled their chamber, cloaks flapping, while the boy was beaten for negligence. In another tale from Italy, hot turnips were used instead of stones, tucked into bed linen after feasts. The image is comical vegetables masquerading as heaters but also telling. People reached for anything that could hold a little warmth. Modern historians argue over how effective these methods really were. Some suggest that hot stones extended comfort by only an hour or two, barely long enough for sleep to come. Others believe the psychological benefit, knowing there was at least a pocket of warmth, was as valuable as the heat itself. The debate remains unresolved, but tonight you feel the truth in your palm. It is warmth, yes, but fleeting, fragile, already fading. You imagine the nightly ritual. Servants scurry from kitchen to chamber, arms full of wrapped bricks, their faces red from carrying the heat close. Nobles slip into bed, pressing icy toes against the stones, sighing at the first sweet flush of warmth. Then, an hour later, they wake, shivering again, the brick now no different from the floor beneath them. The cycle repeats until dawn. A tease, a promise broken, again and again. Odd customs arose from this ritual. Some households used bed wagons. Wooden frames filled with hot embers slid under the mattress to warm it before sleep. Others employed metal pans with long handles, filled with coals and run across the sheets. These inventions often left singed fabric or smoky odors, yet they persisted, passed from servant to servant as duties of the night. The ingenuity is admirable, the results questionable. You sit on the bench, the warm stone tucked beneath your hands. Already the chill seeps back. As if the castle has endless patience, it waits always to reclaim what little heat humans borrow. The stone cools minute by minute, and you understand why chroniclers often described winter nights as a struggle between fire and frost. The fire always lost. Still, you can't help but admire the determination. Every heated stone, every ember carried in trembling hands, was a gesture of resistance against walls that did not care. The people who lived here may have shivered, coughed, and cursed, but they never stopped fighting. Even if the warmth lasted only moments, those moments mattered. You rise, setting the stone aside. Its heat lingers briefly in your skin, then fades. The chamber returns to stillness, damp and cold. You pull your cloak tighter, stepping back into the corridor where the draft greets you once more. The lesson is clear. In a medieval castle, warmth was always a loan, never a gift. Stones cooled, fires guttered, bodies faltered. The only certainty was that the cold endured. You move away from the chamber of fading stones, up another set of stairs, and into a gallery that overlooks the courtyard. Through a narrow shutter, you glimpse tiny thatched roofs huddled close beyond the castle walls. A faint glow rises from them, threads of smoke drifting into the night sky. You pause, surprised, because for a moment you realize something almost heretical. The peasants out there, in their humble cottages, might be warmer than you are inside this grand fortress. It is consistently noted in chronicles that peasant homes, though simple, often held heat better than castles. Low ceilings trapped warmth. Hearths smoked terribly, filling cottages with haze, but the smoke itself clung to thatched roofs, creating insulation. Families, livestock, and belongings, all crammed into a single room, generating shared warmth by sheer proximity. Archaeological excavations reveal packed earth floors blackened with soot and ash, layers that functioned like primitive insulation. You press closer to the shutter, the cold stone biting your cheek. Imagine a peasant family crouched around a central hearth, eyes watering from smoke, but bodies sweating against the fire. A traveller from Flanders once wrote that he found more relief in a shepherd's hut than in a baron's chamber. Another curious anecdote describes a noble visiting his tenants on a winter night and remarking bitterly that their cottage was as hot as a baker's oven, while his own hall mocked the fire like a winter field. Historians argue about whether this comparison is fair. Some suggest the warmth of cottages came at the expense of suffocating air and constant risk of fire. Others insist that the contrast between smoky comfort and stone misery was real, supported by countless noble complaints. The truth likely lies between. The peasants endured smoke and filth, but at least they did not freeze as readily. You imagine yourself leaving the castle tonight, stepping into one of those huts. The floor uneven, the ceiling low, chickens rustling in the corner, children pressed against their parents on a shared straw bed. It would smell of dung and wood smoke, of unwashed bodies and animals. And yet, compared to the castle's damp emptiness, it might feel almost like heaven. A peculiar survival method comes to mind: peat fires. In northern lands, peasants burned peat bricks, which smouldered steadily and filled homes with acrid smoke. Nobles sometimes mocked the smell, yet many letters show envy for the steady warmth those bricks produced. One nobleman wrote grudgingly that the poorest hut oft outshines the richest hall, for their fire clings where ours flees. That bitter line lingers in your mind as you shiver against the shutter. The irony sharpens. Castles, built as symbols of power, turned out to be some of the coldest places to live. Their strength lay in defense, not in comfort. The very thickness of their walls trapped dampness and repelled heat. By contrast, a cottage cobbled together with mud and timber often did better at preserving warmth. Prestige in this sense carried a penalty. You step back from the window, the distant glow of peasant hearths still etched in your mind. You realize that many who lived within the castle likely envied those fires. Letters survive where noble women complained of longing for the humble smoke of the cottages. Their words carry both disdain and yearning, as though they recognized the irony but could never admit it openly. The draught snakes through the shutter once more, and you pull your cloak tighter. Beyond the walls, the peasants huddle, coughing in smoke but basking in warmth. Inside, you stand among stone and silence, surrounded by grandeur but shivering to the bone. For the first time tonight, you wonder which life was truly harsher, the smoky heat of the cottage or the majestic frost of the castle. You leave the gallery and find yourself in another stretch of passage, this one quieter, dimmer, as though the castle has drawn in its breath. The silence reminds you that nights here were not just cold, they were long. The rhythm of life shifted with the seasons. In winter, darkness fell early and lingered until morning, stretching the hours of discomfort into an ordeal that seemed endless. Contemporary sources make this plain. Chronicles note that in winter, peasants and nobles alike retired earlier, sometimes as soon as dusk. With little light and less warmth, there was little to do but retreat beneath blankets. Some letters describe the long night of winter, when the fire burns to ash before sleep is finished. It wasn't simply cold, it was time itself that felt hostile, each hour magnifying the frost in your bones. You step into a chamber where a small group has already settled for the night. They lie curled beneath piles of blankets, shoulders hunched, faces half buried, trying to conserve what little warmth their bodies generate. The stillness is striking. Breathing becomes the only sound, slow and heavy, a rhythm that almost lulls you. And yet, you notice the twitch of shoulders, the occasional cough, the shuffle of feet seeking comfort that never comes. A curious anecdote survives in a letter from a noblewoman in Burgundy. She confessed to sleeping nearly 12 hours each night in winter, not from leisure but from necessity. "The dark forces us into bed, but the cold keeps us from rest," she wrote. Another account describes monks who rose before dawn for prayers, shivering in cloisters so icy that the ink froze in their quills when they attempted to write afterward. These details make you glance at your own fingers, stiff already from the castle's breath. Historians continue to discuss how medieval people coped with such long nights. Some argue that segmented sleep, 2 shorter periods with waking in between, was common. During that waking interval, people might pray, mend clothes, or even visit neighbors. Others question whether this was truly widespread, pointing to evidence of people simply sleeping as long as darkness lasted. The debate remains unresolved, but either way, the result was the same. Cold dominated the hours, shaping not just bodies but schedules. You imagine yourself waking at midnight, the fire long gone, your body stiff with chill. The urge to move, to shake life back into your limbs, would fight against the urge to stay buried under blankets. Letters from the period complain of the cruel choice, to lie still and freeze, or to rise and shiver. Both paths led to misery, proving that comfort was never truly possible. Odd customs grew around this reality. Some households kept bells or clappers to rouse servants in the middle of the night, ensuring fires were stoked and water checked. In Italy, a curious practice emerged of playing quiet board games during the long waking hours. Pieces moved by candlelight while families huddled in blankets. Elsewhere, accounts describe nobles telling stories, stretching words into the darkness as though they could banish the cold by filling the air with sound. You glance around the chamber again. The figures here are silent now, their bodies pressed close in an instinctive defense against the chill. You envy them their shared warmth, though you know it is never enough. Their stillness is not comfort but resignation, the acceptance of hours that must be endured rather than conquered. You step back into the corridor. The silence deepens. Time itself feels slower, each minute drawn out by the weight of frost. The castle does not sleep. It waits, its stones content to trap you in the stretch of night. You realize that this was winter's greatest cruelty, not the sharp sting of air, nor the damp walls, nor the draught through every slit. It was the way time itself lengthened, making every hour of discomfort feel eternal. You climb another flight of spiral stairs, the air thinning with each step. The stones here are slick with frost, and your hand clings to the railing as though it alone keeps you steady. At last you emerge into a small tower chamber, open on one side to the night. The wind howls through, rattling your cloak, and you realize this is a guard post. Someone must stand here every night, watching the darkness for enemies who rarely come, enduring the cold that always does. It is well recorded in military accounts that night watches were among the most dreaded duties in winter. Soldiers or retainers were stationed in towers and along battlements, their armor stiff with ice, their breath freezing into their beards. Chroniclers describe men stamping their feet constantly to keep blood moving, or beating arms across their chests until shoulders bruised. In some places, guards rotated every hour. In others, they were expected to last until dawn. Imagine staring into an endless night, toes numb, ears burning, listening for footsteps that never arrive. You step forward into the open space, and the wind claws at your face. The view is wide fields, forests, faint stars trembling above. Yet the grandeur means nothing when your body shakes from the cold. You try to picture a knight standing here in full mail. The metal would chill faster than fabric, pressing cold directly against the body. Accounts from sieges even mention frostbite beneath armor, as sweat from the day froze into sheets of ice at night. There are curious anecdotes of ingenuity. One Scottish garrison supposedly shared cloaks between men, wrapping two at a time, so that one half of each body stayed warmer. In Germany, guards burned small piles of dung in corners of towers, the acrid smoke preferable to frost. Whether these tales are exaggerated or not, they reveal the desperation of men tasked with surviving long nights in the wind. Historians remain divided over just how effective guard rotations were. Some argue that frequent changeovers prevented disaster, others believe lords economized, forcing men to endure shifts too long for safety. Surviving accounts include both guards collapsing from exhaustion and guards praising brief watches that saved their lives. The lack of certainty mirrors the uncertainty of the night itself. You lean against the parapet, fingers numb. Far below, the village lies silent, faint fires glowing in cottages. The contrast stings. Inside those smoky huts, people press together, coughing but warm. Up here, surrounded by battlements and banners, you are king of nothing but frost. A peculiar tale comes from a French fortress, where a guard reportedly mistook icicles breaking from the tower for enemy arrows, sounding an alarm that roused the entire garrison. The story sounds humorous now, but it underscores the delirium of men who had stared too long into the freezing dark. Fatigue, cold, and fear turn stone walls into traps of the imagination. Your own ears ache, stinging until they feel like shards of glass. You tug your hood lower, but the wind slips in regardless. Your hands shake, and you know you could not last long here without relief. Yet night after night, men did. They stood watch in armor, eyes watering, jaws clenched, their very presence a promise of safety for the castle. They endured the unendurable because duty required it. You step back from the open side of the chamber, retreating to the stairwell. The wind follows, echoing down the spiral like a predator that refuses to be shut out. As you descend, you think of those countless guards who left pieces of themselves on the battlements, ears, toes, fingers, sometimes lives. The cold claimed them silently, as effectively as any sword. The castle may have kept enemies at bay, but every winter it waged its own siege from within, and the men who stood here, night after night, were its most expendable casualties. You descend from the tower, ears still burning from the bite of the wind. The stairwell spirals endlessly downward, the stone groaning faintly under your boots. At last you emerge into another corridor, darker than the rest. Here the silence is thick, broken only by the whisper of the wind slipping through unseen cracks. You pause, and suddenly you hear it, a long, low moan that seems to rise from the walls themselves. At first you think it might be voices. The sound is mournful, fluctuating with the gusts. In truth, it is nothing more than the night air threading through narrow gaps, but to the people who lived here centuries ago, such noises were anything but ordinary. Contemporary letters describe the castle singing with winter and walls that wail until dawn. To tired, shivering ears, the drafts themselves became ghosts. You walk slowly, hand brushing the stone. The air moves along the corridor like an invisible river, pushing your cloak one way, then tugging it back. You realize this is what the nights truly sounded like. Not silence, but whispers, rattles, and creaks, the constant conversation of stone and wind. Imagine lying awake in your bed, curtains drawn, while the castle groans as if it were alive. One curious anecdote from a Welsh stronghold tells of servants convinced that banshees haunted the stairwells because the wind produced shrieks so sharp they swore they heard words. Another tale from Burgundy describes noble guests startled awake by knocking sounds in the walls, later discovered to be loose shutters. These stories may sound like superstition, but as you stand here listening, you understand their truth. The castle's very architecture turned drafts into apparitions. Scholars continue to debate how deeply such sounds influenced medieval belief in spirits. Some argue that ghost stories were fueled by imagination sharpened by cold and fatigue. Others maintain that the castle's eerie acoustics genuinely fostered belief in the supernatural. The evidence is inconclusive, but the resonance of stone amplifies the possibility. Tonight, you hear it for yourself, the sigh of air that might easily pass for a whispered warning. You press deeper into the corridor. Torches sputter weakly, shadows stretching and twisting. Each gust bends the flames sideways, painting shapes that seem to lurch along the wall. You blink, half certain you've seen movement. For a moment, the castle feels haunted not by the dead, but by the endless chill shaping sound and sight into illusions. The temperature here seems colder than in the hall. Perhaps it is the absence of bodies, or perhaps the drafts are simply stronger. You hunch your shoulders, cloak drawn tighter, but the air still finds you. It slithers into the folds, strokes your skin with icy fingers. You imagine the medieval inhabitants whispering prayers when the winds grew too eerie, begging saints to keep restless spirits away. A peculiar custom survives in a few records, leaving bread or milk in corners of drafty chambers, not for pests but for night wanderers. Whether these were spirits, fairies, or merely metaphors for the cold itself, no one can say. But the act reveals how people sought meaning in discomfort, turning unexplained noises into narratives of the unseen. You pause again, letting the moans rise and fall. They sound almost human, a chorus of voices echoing through centuries. You know it is merely wind, yet your skin prickles all the same. You realize that the castle's true terror was not only its physical chill, but its ability to make the imagination shiver too. Cold altered more than bodies, it reshaped minds, filled nights with apparitions, taught fear alongside frost. At last, you move toward a door at the end of the corridor. The moans fade behind you, though you know they will return the moment the next gust slides through. You step into another chamber, and silence greets you once more. But in your ears, the echoes linger. The castle hums with its own voice, a song of winter that never stops. You close the heavy door behind you and enter a larger chamber where servants have gathered. The air is thick with the musk of bodies pressed together, wool cloaks overlapping, shoulders hunched against the chill. At first, you think the smell, unpleasant sweat, smoke, damp straw, but then you realize it carries something rare in this castle: warmth. Not warmth from fire or stone, but from human bodies leaning into one another, turning shared discomfort into shared survival. It is well recorded that medieval households relied on proximity to endure winter nights. Families often slept several to a bed, layering blankets over one another, limbs intertwined. In castles, servants crowded onto pallets, huddling close, sometimes 3 or 4 beneath a single cloak. To modernize, it might seem cramped or undignified. To them, it was life itself. You lower yourself beside them, feeling the press of shoulders. Instantly, the difference is clear. The damp drafts still creep along the floor, but the warmth of bodies counters it. Breathing slows, mist rising in unison. You sense how comforting it must have felt, this rhythm of lungs and hearts. each person carrying a fragment of heat for the others. Curious anecdotes illustrate this intimacy. A 15th century French traveller wrote with surprise of noble children sleeping two to a bed, like peasants, though the parents defended it as practical. Another tale from northern England describes servants deliberately sleeping in alternating directions, feet to heads, so that toes could be warmed by faces, a peculiar arrangement but one that shared warmth more evenly. Odd perhaps, but ingenious. Scholars still debate whether this closeness was purely practical or also shaped social bonds. Some argue that constant physical proximity fostered tighter household communities. Others suggest it bred tensions, quarrels, and discomfort. The evidence is mixed. Some letters describe affectionate loyalty among servants, others complaints about snoring and restlessness. Either way, the practice of huddling together cannot be denied. You notice a young boy curled against his mother's side, his hands tucked beneath her arm. A dog lies across their feet, its fur rising and falling with theirs. The trio looks strangely serene, despite the stone chamber. You realize that warmth was never solitary here. It always required company, whether of beasts or humans. Odd customs crop up in chronicles too. In some German castles, communal sleeping was accompanied by singing before bed, low chants meant to distract from the cold. In Italy, families prayed aloud as they lay down, their voices overlapping until silence fell. Such rituals, practical or spiritual, helped pass the longest hours, transforming discomfort into endurance. You adjust your cloak and feel another shoulder lean into you. For a moment, you too are part of the circle. The warmth is fragile but real, as though each heartbeat adds a spark to the shared fire. And yet, it is temporary. As soon as one person shifts away, the chill creeps back. You understand now why the phrase, keeping company, carried literal weight. It was not only companionship, but survival. Still, questions remain. Did nobles truly huddle like this, or only their servants? Some scholars argue that the wealthy clung stubbornly to solitary beds, even when freezing. Others believe that even in grand chambers, closeness was quietly practiced. The truth may never be certain. What is certain is the rhythm you feel now. The steady exhalations, the shared breath warming the stone just enough to soften the edge of night. You close your eyes, listening to the faint murmur of prayers, the shuffle of straw, the occasional sigh. For once, the castle does not feel hostile. It feels human, filled with warmth borrowed from one another. But when you open your eyes again, you know dawn will scatter them, and the cold will reclaim the walls. This moment of comfort is only a pause in the siege. You rise quietly, leaving them to their rest. The chamber door creaks behind you, and the draught greets you once more, sharper after the brief reprieve. You walk on, understanding that in a medieval castle, warmth was never yours alone. It was something shared, fragile, and fleeting like life itself within these walls. You step back into the corridor for what feels like the last time tonight. The castle seems quieter now, as if even the stone has grown weary of its own breath. You wander slowly, every step echoing across flagstones that have tested your patience since the moment you entered. At last you find yourself in a small chamber overlooking the courtyard, a place where the night and the fortress seem to merge. You stop there, cloak wrapped tight, and reflect on what the hours have shown you. Everywhere you have gone, the cold has followed. The grand hall, with its vast hearth, proved to be a cavern where heat drowned in shadows. The noble chambers, hung with tapestries and layered with velvet, still bore frost on their windows and draughts through their shutters. The servants' loft revealed hands cracked by frostbite, toes stiff and raw. Even the chapel, meant to lift the spirit, demanded prayers from knees pressed into stone that numbed the very bones. History confirms this relentless discomfort. Household accounts document endless purchases of fuel, repairs of shutters, replacements of bedding, proof that even the wealthiest families struggled. Medical texts list remedies for winter chills and lung fevers, prescriptions more desperate than effective. And in the margins of letters, You find casual notes of misery, pictures frozen, ink stiff, fingers trembling as quills scratched complaints. All of them whisper the same truth. A medieval castle was magnificent to behold but merciless to inhabit. You lean your forehead against the wall. It is damp, clammy, unyielding. You cannot help thinking of the peasants outside the walls, coughing in smoky cottages but clutching one another by warm fires. Their comfort was rough, but it was comfort nonetheless. The castle, in contrast, traded warmth for grandeur, protection, and pride. Its people paid nightly for that trade. Curious images resurface: lapdogs tucked beneath blankets, monks holding hot bricks during prayer, guards sharing cloaks in the tower, noblewomen confessing they envied the heat of peasants' cottages. Odd customs, strange adaptations, desperate tricks, all these were testaments to resilience. Yet they also underscored the futility. No matter the strategy, the cold always won. Scholars continue to debate the extent of this suffering. Some argue that medieval people were hardened, less sensitive than we are, more accustomed to discomfort. Others counter that their own complaints, preserved across centuries, prove the misery was as sharp then as you feel it now. The disagreement may never be settled, but your body tonight leans toward the latter. The wind rattles the shutters once more. It sounds like a sigh, weary but victorious. You pull your cloak tighter, but the fabric feels thin now, worn down by hours of exposure. Your shoulders ache, your fingers stiffen. You realize that if you were to stay another night, just one more, you would not endure it. The cold would seep too deep, nor too long, until you surrendered to sleep you might not wake from. You step away from the wall, glance once more at the empty chamber, and feel the weight of the castle pressing in. Its stones have stood for centuries, weathering wars and storms. Yet within, it has always waged its own quiet war against its inhabitants. Tonight, you have been both witness and victim. And tonight you understand why so many letters, poems, and anecdotes circle back to the same refrain. The castle was strong, yes, but never kind. The thought lingers as your breath curls into mist. You would not last here, not a night, not truly. And as you turn from the window, you know the truth echoes through history. No one ever did. They endured, survived, persisted, but comfort was a stranger behind these walls. And now, as the night within the castle draws to a close, let the pace soften. Imagine the stone walls fading into shadow, their chill no longer pressing, their drafts no longer whispering. The corridors that once groaned with wind grow still, and the echoes of coughs, footsteps, and sighs dissolve into silence. The great hearth dims to embers, glowing faintly like tired eyes. The curtains around beds sag heavy, their folds unmoving. Even the animals curled in straw rest quietly now, their steady breathing mingling with that of the servants who lean against them. For a moment, the entire fortress seems to exhale, surrendering its nightly siege. You walk slowly down the corridor, no longer hurried, no longer resisting. Each step carries less weight, as though the stone itself grows softer beneath your feet. The air remains cool, but not cruel. It settles gently now, no longer biting. Where once you felt haunted by drafts, you now hear only a lullaby of quiet wind, wrapping around you like a blanket. Close your eyes and picture the night lifting, the first pale hints of dawn brushing across battlements. In the cottages beyond the walls, smoke curls upward again, signaling warmth returned. In the castle too, fires will be stoked, voices will stir, life will begin again. But that belongs to tomorrow. Tonight, the cold fades, and with it, your need to resist. Let your shoulders loosen, your breath deepen, your thoughts slow. The castle may be eternal, but the night is not. Morning always comes, and with it, release. Allow yourself to drift into that quiet certainty now, carried gently into sleep. Sweet dreams.